After driving the van for a little bit, I've started to realize that the back brakes, there's something a little bit wrong with them. When you push the brake pedal, it just doesn't quite feel right. So what I suspected was that there was a leak in one of the back cylinders, and therefore the back brakes weren't applying, leaving just the front brakes to be done. Now the reason I know that it's not the front brakes is because the previous owner had actually done the calipers, and you can actually look inside, they're all brand new. We bled those ones, and the front brake circuit seems to be fine, but the rear brake circuit from the master cylinder was a little low. So that's why I was assuming that there was a leak in the back. Because I live in snowy, cold, salty, wet Alberta, getting the actual drums off is impossible most of the time. Now there are some cars that throw you a bone, like the Lotta Niva over here. This one has a really cool screw where you take the bolts that retain the drums out, put them in different holes, and then screw it in, and actually pulls the drum off for you. That's fantastic. This RX-7 here has that as well. This thing did not. This thing was absolutely stuck on the passenger side. I smacked on this thing with a hammer for ages trying to get it to release. I ended up finally getting it to release by using a map torch on it. But it took way longer than it needed to, and it really sucked. I'm not a huge fan of drum brakes. I find them kind of a pain in the ass to work with. And the reason for that being that there's quite a few springs inside of the brake drum that you have to pull off in order to actually get the shoes apart. And getting them off is one thing, but getting them back on is kind of another. So as for why manufacturers chose to use drum brakes and actually are still using drum brakes, is because they are a little bit cheaper to produce versus a disc brake. And that's mainly just because these wheel cylinders are a lot smaller, so there's a smaller sealing area. There's not as much like difficult casting. And then these companies can just go to, you know, Robert Bosch or whoever's designing these OEM brake components, Valeo or, you know, Delco or GM will have all of this on stock. They'll just go to the shelf, they'll pick out a brake cylinder, and it's insanely cheap. Like an aftermarket brake cylinder is like $7. The springs cost nothing. The shoes, although they are a little bit bigger than pads, they also are fairly cheap as well. You can usually get a set of shoes for about $30, so it's about the same as pads, really. There's my leak. In a lot of older vehicles, you'll see this. Usually it's in the rear brakes. It's not very common to have drum brakes in the front. Motorcycles, older motorcycles like pre-19, I want to say like 1990 or so, will almost always have drum brakes on the front and the back. Some of the bigger bikes like the 900s and the 1000s and stuff from that era will have discs. And I mean, modern bikes nowadays have, you know, 2-3 discs per wheel. So it's changed quite a bit, but still drum brakes are being used. So drum brakes are actually still being used in some newer EVs. And the reason for that they claim is they claim that it works better in regards to regeneration, the regenerative braking systems that they use. I'm not sure how much of that I personally believe. But I do know for a fact that drum brakes are a lot cheaper to produce. They do produce significantly less braking force. However, you have the regenerative braking, plus you probably don't need the clamping power of a disc anyways. Now my camera totally missed me putting the rest of the thing back together because I only have a 5-minute limit. So imagine that I put the drum on and then I did up the bolts. Not that difficult. So under here, while I was doing this side, the brake line decided to get all twisted up because, as is everything in this godforsaken country, it's rusted to shit. So I'm gonna get a new one of these, and then while I'm at it, I'm also gonna do the other side as well. Alrighty, so this was the old brake hose. As you can see, this end is like absolutely wrecked, rusted in. So went over to the parts store and bought some nice bendable hoses, a nice big long one, and we'll get it bent up and put them in. Here's the drum brake system out of a 1960s era, or pretty much a modern era Honda Cub scooter. So as you can see, these are your brake shoes on here, and then what would go over top of this would be the actual brake drum. So you can see that this here is full of the actual brake material. So this is actually a wear material that gets bonded on, sometimes using rivets. In this case, it looks like it's been sintered on with some sort of like high temperature adhesive. Now, these are those two springs that I was talking about, and you can see these are pretty beefy springs. If you just look at the size of the wire in there, I don't know if you can see that very well, but the size of the wire is pretty substantial, considering that these brakes are probably only, I want to say, maybe 8 inches across. Now, this part at the bottom here is your pivot, and this is what actually actuates the brakes. So in an automotive system, typically on a like relatively modern automotive system, this thing is going to be a brake cylinder that is going to have a hydraulic input, and it's going to have 2 cylinders on either side that push directly against the bottom. And typically the brake's going to be oriented like this, right? So your brake cylinder will be at the top, and it'll be pushing both of these shoes out like this. Now, in this case, this one doesn't have it. This one is just a standard run-of-the-mill manually actuated brake. So when I pull on this lever, which would be equivalent to applying the brakes, what you're going to see is that thing moves, and it pushes the top of the brake pads out. And in doing that, it pushes against the drum, which applies friction, which slows the wheel down. So relatively simple system, as you can see, not particularly complicated, but you can see how much force I'm putting on it. Like it's a pretty sizable amount of force even for my hands, and I have quite the mechanical advantage. To give you an idea how tight these springs are, I'm going to try and pull these apart with my hand. I can kind of barely get it, you know, but they're still very tough. And with this mechanical advantage, you can see it's still, that's quite a bit of force. Hopefully that helps clear some things up. So after finishing the brakes, I decided that a good thing to do was to go and get the propane filled. Now, typically, I should have probably thought of this, that, you know, hey, it's a 40-year-old propane tank, maybe it's probably a good idea to get it, you know, inspected. But I live in a province where they don't actually do inspections on the coach propane of RVs. The tank itself is not actually stamped or validated at all in this province. The only thing that's really actually looked at is the valves. And on this one, the valve failed. Right as they were filling it, the guy goes, connects the hose up to it, fills it with propane, goes to take it off, and, you know, we hear a right, and we're like, oh crap. So he puts it back on, he hits it a few times, still nothing, it's still hissing. So, you know, being that now we've got a 35-pound tank of propane that's leaking, we have to call the fire department. The fire department comes out, they set up a big tiger torch, and they burn this thing off. We were there for probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours waiting for this tank to burn off. Everything was okay, as it turns out. I went and took the van to a propane specialist. He had a look at it. He said the tank was good, and all he needed to do was replace the valve. So that cost me about $300. You know, it wasn't the end of the world, but it was definitely a wrench in the gears. But that's fortunately all fixed now. So I bled the van. It works great. I went out to Cold Lake. I went out to another campsite that me and my wife's family go to. And the van performed fantastically. It was really great. I know that there's a lot of people who have been talking about, you know, oh, it needs total rebuild. But I thought it really wasn't too bad. So that's where I'm at. And thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. And have a good one.